we really underestimated how impactful feminism was. And I've argued before that it has reshaped the very definition of blackness. Whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not, it has dramatically shifted the dynamic. And a few shows ago, I talked about the black masculinist turn with Ice Cube and the Cocktails with Queens and the discussion they had in, I believe, 2020, where, again, Cube is trying to talk about an agenda for Black America, but he's talking to a group of Black women that are primarily concerned with Black women. They later apologized, but the damage was done. I think the rise and success of Kevin Samuels' platform is another Black masculinist term because, granted, it was really a combination of factors that made it happen. If the pandemic didn't happen, I don't think his channel would have blown up. He had a captive audience, pulling a lot of the talking points out of the manosphere. I don't, if he didn't have those talking points, I don't think it would have blown up. There were a number of factors that really came together, but in the midst of that coming together, the midst of the rise of Kevin's platform, you got to see Black women on display saying the most egregious, dehumanizing things about Black men. And it would happen night after night after night after night. And it wasn't something he had to trick them into saying. He didn't have to pay for them to say, none of that. They would just come out with it. And it would happen so often that whole paradigm, in my assessment, is another Black masculinist turn. Because even if you couldn't stand him and you hated his guts, when you hear the things that would come out of some of these women's mouths, and these are everyday women, from on welfare to six-figure earning women. It was across the spectrum, across class, across status, across beauty, across color, and sometimes even across race. You got to hear it come from so many different women that you could no longer easily deny it. And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to make this about his toxicity. But the conversation is really about what we learned about women's perspectives from the conversations. So, and of course, one of the latest turns is his passing and how people have talked about him, and they focused on a certain type of intense misandry that really that they're presenting to be about Kevin. But it doesn't take long before you find out it really don't have nothing to do with Kevin. It's just an excuse to just throw up the worst kind of bile about Black men. And so that too is another Black masculinist turn. But anyway, this shift in feminism, this shift in focus, this redefinition of Blackness on gendered terms that only really includes Black women and LGBTs and heterosexual Black men are really not considered a part of, has been with us for a while. It really has. We just didn't know it. And so when I talk about ambush feminism, that's really what I'm referring to. Right? Ambush meaning that it was there, but we didn't understand what it was, and it really caught us off guard. It's almost as if men, particularly heterosexual men, have no stake in gender, and the expectation is you shut up and let those others, lead the discussion or foreground themselves and alienate you from the discourse. It is an idea that is irrespective of Black men and boys. We are incidental to that particular agenda. And this is where we find ourselves now. It's been culminating for years. It has cultivated a very particular type of hatred, much of which we drastically underestimate the extent of. I truly believe that so many white feminists like the work of bell hooks because it allows them to rationalize their racist aversion to Black men through Black feminism. Absolutely. And if you look into Dr. Tommy Curry's work, especially on subcultural violence theory, he talks about the very particular white scholars that produced many of these talking points, these rhetorical positions with no evidence, and the degree to which Black feminist scholars in the 70s and 80s wholeheartedly took those various quotations, those various arguments, incorporated it in their works like bell hooks, and came out with drivel like this that characterizes Black men based on racist white scholarship, that frames us as monsters that are victimized and have to victimize because we're victimized. But there's not one citation in that whole passage that I read from bell hooks, which she was not one to do on a regular basis. And I'm thinking, you're upset with a guy on YouTube that basically blew up in the last 2 years, but we've been reading this shit in college university classes since the fucking 1980s. When I paid for graduate school, I had to sit and listen to this. I had to sit and read these works and then argue with feminist professors who were twice my age. about things I wasn't even born into that they're referencing in college classrooms, in graduate school classrooms. I had to argue against the mischaracterization of Black men by professional, degreed, studied, quote unquote, feminists. You know what that feels like to be 19 years old, sitting in a graduate program, or I think, wait, no, 21. I think it was 21. Yeah, started in the same. Okay, so to be 21 years old, arguing with someone who's your grandmother's age, who looks like your grandmother, and who's telling you that you are the monster that white scholarship has always said you were, right? But y'all mad about a dude on YouTube from 2 years ago, from the last 2 years? Really? So we're going to disregard the last 40 years plus of what Black men have been reading in classes, watching on television, seeing in films, having their own daughters and sons re-invoked because that's what they think Black maleness is. But nobody has anything to say about that. The perception of Black men and women as distinctly different, let alone Black men being less than, servile, or perceived as a lesser being, is something that many of us don't want to accept, but we grapple with it on a daily. The men in the comment section can tell you stories about being dismissed at the workplace, in the family. And we're 4 generations into this at the very least. At the very least. From boomers to Generation X to millennials to Generation Z, you're seeing practices handed down that are often predicated on ideas of Black male inferiority. Nobody cares. Black men are starting to grumble about it. And the first response we get is to be ignored. The second response we get is to be downplayed and dismissed, to be gaslighted, to be told that there's nothing there and this is just made up. It isn't. But because we don't have access to the same type of popular culture, frameworks, we don't have television channels or magazines that pay attention to us. It took free social medias for us to compare notes. And as we're starting to speak out amongst ourselves, and we have people coming into these spaces trying to either popularize, or I shouldn't say popularize, they're trying to either profit in one way, shape, or form off of these discussions or dismiss them and downplay them altogether. Black men are still starting to speak up, and they're slowly starting to organize. Black men who are traveling internationally, Black men who are devout nationalists, devout revolutionaries, but are marrying women from other countries. These are not incidental, accidental things. These are Black men responding to conditions in their environment despite being told that what they're experiencing isn't happening. We're told that, it's just rain, or we're tasting urine. And brothers have decided to no longer stand out and be told that they don't know what piss smells like. So they found other means. And this is how Black men have been moving, with their feet, very quietly. Much of that because we never had a vocabulary to explain ourselves. We were never asked. I've actually heard scholars at conferences, at Black Studies conferences, say there's nothing new to talk about with Black men. We've talked about enough. Everything we've already created for them stands. We don't need to talk about them anymore. If we need to come back to that, we'll grab an old lecture or paper from 20 years ago. That will suffice. Every group of men that you idolize in terms of their business acumen, their skill, whatever, they've all had support. Generational support, inheritance, governmental support, policy. All of the men that have been business moguls that we put up on pedestals amongst men, all of them had fucking support. All of them. They come from a context that is so rooted in support that they don't even see it as support. And this tends to happen when people get that. And yes, that does include Black women in the last 4 to 5 decades. Absolutely. I've done a show, BGS and I did a show a few weeks ago talking about the lists of benefits that went to poor Black women, to middle class Black women, and to Black women as a whole, much of which was a product of white feminism and the contract between Black women and white women. White women offered advancement for Black female support, and they got it. This is why most Black women can operate and use Black feminist talking points, but they've never actually read a Black feminist text. It was predicated off an arrangement with white feminists, an exchange, public support for access. Damned what Black men need. Damned what their sons, their grandsons, husbands, boyfriends, fathers, none of that mattered. He can't do what I can do. Look at us. We're going to school and record. You know what? You don't want to hear that from me. Why don't we actually hear it from someone else who can articulate how many Black women today think of this better than I can?
What do you think the challenge is that women are having, Black women in particular, when it comes to becoming a wife?
Keeping it 100, there's not enough eligible Black males who fit the needs of Black women. By the time you dissect the demographics.
Hold on. And by the way, it's not that they don't fit the needs of Black women. They don't fit the wants of Black women. We use a standard that is rare. We generically say six figures. We talked about this for months on my show. Six figures today doesn't mean what it meant in the 1980s. For the most part, if you become six figures today, it means that it's low six figures. If you cross 100,000, it means your bills are paid. That's really all it means. It doesn't mean you're driving a Lamborghini, but still, even for those Black men that achieve that, you're talking about less than 10%. And yet this is the measuring stick that all Black men are measured against. And if we say we want a beauty standard or a cooperation standard, that's considered misogynistic. But when women say they want high profile men that have a high level income, there's no problem with that. Even though, even amongst women, there are still more Black men that make that than Black women. When we went through the BLS data, BGS and I did this over a year ago. Went through the BLS data, we showed that at every age group from 18 to 65, Black men made more than Black women for those Black men that were employed. And as opposed to that being seen as a means for whereby we actually begin to frame relationships, no, we're still going to overwhelmingly fixate on the top 9% of Black men and then say, because there's not more than 9%, Black men are failing. But the reality is no group has an extreme, like nobody has 90% of six-figure income earners. This is fucking ridiculous. That's not what's happening. But this is the comfortable narrative that these women are allowed to give. Let's continue.
Of finances, sexual orientation, what you end up drilling down into, because Black women tend to want to marry Black men.
Right.
So Black women are excelling. They're getting accelerated degrees, graduate degrees, doctorate degrees. They're starting businesses. Black women are running circles around men.
It's just straight bullshit. It's straight bullshit, right? They're not running circles. There are more that are getting degrees, yes. But when you look at income, see, part of the issue, and I've said this before, is if you live in Atlanta, New York, LA, and you see these women congregating at high-level restaurants making six figures, then it seems like, wow, they're running circles. But when you actually look at the data, no. We do have different types of labor. We do have different educational experiences, okay? And many Black men have gone with that program. Why? Many of us were raised by the very women that are doing this. We don't know how to go against mama. So we do it. We support it. We're patted on the head. We're told that we're good men as long as we shut up and do so.